There he is.
All right, it's 6 o'clock. Just want to welcome everybody to the OSUIT Diversity and Inclusion Speaker Series. Today we have a wonderful presentation on systemic racism, and it is my privilege and honor to introduce our panelists we have this evening. We have 4 panelists. We've got Tara Branson-Thomas, Dr. Lewis Brogdon, Bishop Frederick M. Brown Jr., and last but not least, but Jace DeCory. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to give you a quick background on each of our speakers, and then I will just go over some housekeeping business, and then we'll turn it over to Dana for questioning. So first I want to introduce Tara Branson-Thomas. Tara is a citizen of Muskogee Nation and currently serves as the Secretary of the Nation in Commerce. The Secretary of the Nation Commerce is an appointed and confirmed cabinet position responsible for the nation's economic development, intergovernmental relationships, and social welfare policy development. Ms. Branson-Thomas has extensive experience in Indian policy and legislative history, particularly in the areas of self-governance and self-determination. She also is a wealth of knowledge regarding tribal governments, nonprofit organizations, federal grant writing and administration, strategic planning and program implementation. Her professional experiences include national tribal nonprofit management, federal compacting and negotiations, federal and tribal legislative development, federal grant management, and grassroots organizing. Tara has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Native American Studies from Dartmouth College and a Master's of Public Policy from Georgetown University. Welcome, Tara. Secondly, we've got Dr. Lewis Brogdon, building bridges between the church communities and the academy. That's how his bio is quoted. Dr. Brogdon serves as the research professor of preaching and Black church studies at the Black Baptist Seminary of Kentucky and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Simmons College of Kentucky. He has served in numerous positions in undergraduate and graduate institutions as a professor, assistant professor of New Testament and Black church studies at Louisville Seminary, and religion and biblical studies at Claflin University, and an associate professor of Christian studies at Bluefield College. He also served those institutions as an administrator, the founding director of Louisville Seminary Black Church Studies Program, provost at Simmons College of Kentucky, and dean of institutional effectiveness and research at Bluefield College. Brogdon is an accomplished writer. He is the author of several books. He is also a regular contributor to Christian Ethics Today and Black Politics Today. He has authored numerous articles and book chapter essays for both academic and non-academic audiences. Dr. Brogdon is also a public intellectual and sought-out preacher, lecturer, consultant, and panelist, like today. Brogdon delivers lectures on Martin Luther King Jr., the debate about reparations for African Americans, and recent protests about the death of George Floyd in colleges and for community organizations. He has developed academic courses on the study of Martin Luther King Jr. for 4 educational institutions in Virginia and Kentucky. Dr. Brogdon was also the keynote speaker at a citywide Martin Luther King dinner in Dayton, Ohio, and received an invitation to the White House in 2014. Also, he is a special guest on Black Politics Today and presents workshops at many conferences. He is also an ordained minister for 27 years and has pastored churches in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. Welcome, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you.
Third panelist we have today is Bishop Frederick M. Brown Jr. Bishop Frederick M. Brown Jr. of Charlotte, North Carolina, established an intimate relationship with the Lord at a very early age of 12 12 years old while attending a revival in Southern West Virginia. Growing up in a Christian environment, great spiritual things in his life were inevitable. Bishop Brown's ministry began as a singer, musician, and a songwriter. Then God began revealing the next dimension of his destiny, which was to develop a fivefold ministry. Currently, he is the founder, senior pastor at Faith Center Church in Bluefield, West Virginia, presiding bishop for Communion of Covenant Ministries International, founder and senior pastor at Faith Center Church of Charlotte in Charlotte, North Carolina. He is married to the beautiful Lady Aisha Brown and is the proud father of Joshua and 13-month-old twins, Miles and Merrick. Joshua is a recent graduate of Florida State University. Bishop Brown quotes, "My past is forgiven by God. My present is kept by God. My future is ordained by God." And that's Bishop Brown. And lastly, but not least, we've got Ms. Jace DeCory. Ms. Jace DeCory, she is Lakota. Okay, I'm going to try my best to say this. Oshet Chakowin. I'll let her tell us. Say it better. Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. She is the Assistant Professor Emerita for American Indian Studies at the Black Hills State University in Spearfish, South Dakota. After teaching American Indian Study classes at the Black Hills State University for 33 years in the College of Liberal Arts, she finally retired in June of 2017, although I doubt she's fully retired. Jace continues to give cultural presentations, and her interests lie in Lakota history, art, philosophy, American Indian women, and cultural change. Jace is a proponent of healthy lifestyles for Indigenous people and has worked to develop health-related materials to inform and educate. She has given presentations at various health-related workshops, including the use of traditional tobacco in Lakota society for ceremony and prayer. She was instrumental in the development of a culture guide to assist folks working with American Indian people. And in 2006, her work was part of a project export grant at the Black Hills State University. Jace's guiding forces are her two sons, Junior and Dawson, and her grandchildren. She enjoys beading baby moccasins for relatives and friends, and she credits Lakota elders for providing guidance, prayers, and support throughout her life. Her ends with, quote, "For all my relations, we are all related." And those are our four panelists, and I'm, like I said, very honored to introduce these folks. And so right now, if anyone has questions, what we're going to do is Dana is going to present questions to our panelists. They will each have time to speak. And for those who have questions that are in our audience, we ask that you put them in the chat box, and then Dana will address those questions when we get to our question and answer period. Does that sound about right, Dana?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dana. Thank you.
And, thank you so much, Randy. And thank you to our panelists for joining us this evening. We're very much looking forward to the discussion. I want to take a quick minute to introduce the co-chair with me of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. You can see her picture there, Lisa Currington. And then I'm Dana Sterling. There she is. I'm Dana Sterling, and I teach English at OSUIT, and Lisa's co-chair of the committee. Also, the event tonight is being recorded, so in a few days it will be posted to the diversity page on our website, so you can let people know who didn't have a chance to come. Our topic tonight is systemic racism, and this was important to Lisa and to me to include as one of our diversity learning series topics because because it's so widely misunderstood, and I think it's a crucial part for understanding the impact of racism in the United States, and sometimes people even have said that they don't think it's even real at all. So we wanted to really make this an educational opportunity and delve into that. And first, you know, starting at the beginning, let's start with some definitions. So what I'd like to do is have our panelists simply tell us, how would you define systemic racism? What is it? And I would like to start with Professor DeCory.
Of course, you have to start with me. Thank you, Dana. I appreciate that being first. You know, I'm gonna read what I wrote down because I didn't think I'd be asked to give the definition. I was gonna say ditto when somebody else, you know, explained it, but I will try to explain it, how I feel about it. When I think of systemic racism, I think of institutional racism. That's a term that us old school folks have been using for many, many generations, but systemic seems to be the terminology now. So a form of racism embedded as normal practice, nothing's normal, but as normal practice within a society or an organization. It can lead to such issues as discrimination and criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other issues. I've seen more overt issues or examples of systemic racism today, but generally systemic racism is generally less overt, more subtle, if you will, in nature, and it originates in the operation of established and respected forces in society. And so because it is so, sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's so embedded in our societies that it oftentimes receives less public condemnation than individual or overt racism, because most of us can understand that idea of overt racism. You know, we can feel it if nothing else, but systemic racism is more hidden, but it's obviously there because we're still dealing with it. As Lakota people, we've been dealing with systemic racism and white supremacy, if you will, for hundreds of years. But we called it a little bit different. We call it settler violence or settler mentality, one which perpetuates manifest destiny, the taking of land, and not only land, but position from those lands. And it makes it somehow okay because after all, we as Native people are savages, we're heathens. So it's become a way of a mentality that people think it's okay to do these kinds of things and to act in these manners because that's the way it's always been done and that's how we look at these people. So I guess that's enough for me.
Thank you. Dr. Brogdon, would you like to go next?
Absolutely. The noun racism is important before we attach the adjective systemic to it, because we often really misunderstand what racism is because we often think of the word prejudice. We think of individual bias against a person who is different. That really doesn't get at what systemic, what structural racism really is. You have to begin to think broader. So a part of the problem we have in this country is when we hear the word racism, many people often think of being prejudiced against Black people, against Native Americans, against Hispanic Americans, etc. And so that's not what we're talking about. Racism and prejudice are different. Systemic or structural racism is really technically defined in critical race theory as a system of advantage based on race. So that's David Wellman's, Beverly Tatum. She also used David Wellman's book called Portraits of White Racism to develop her term, what she calls prejudice plus power. So as a social group, if you are prejudiced against another social group and you have the power to enforce your prejudice, That's systemic racism. Now, there's a new scholar named Dr. Ibram Kendi, whose book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is just a book I really recommend that you read. You need to take a look at it. Because what Kendi argues is that the term systemic racism doesn't make a lot of sense to people, and it's why it can't get traction. So he wants people to think about, you're either racist or anti-racist. And when he uses the term racist, he's talking about policies and ideas, not people. So that when we're having conversations about racism, we're not directing these conversations against people, but we're talking about there are policies and there are ideas that are racist. And the only way to undo the legacy of these policies and these ideas is to be an anti-racist. You can't be neutral and say, well, I'm not racist. You're either racist in that you're upholding these policies and ideas, or you're being anti-racist in that you're trying to dismantle these policies and these ideas that have a protracted history in this country that goes all the way back to this country's origins. So that, I think that's a helpful way to kind of wrap your head around systemic racism.
Thank you. Secretary Branson Thomas.
I really appreciated Dr. Brogdon's example of policies and ideas, because I think there are people who move through the world according to the rules or to the policy or to the procedure without recognizing the impact that it has in communities or where it sort of begins and generates. And so I definitely agree with the description and the definition. And I think I too tend to call it institutional racism or historic. A lot of times when we are moving forward and using existing policies and procedures, they're based in some kind of historic process. And the people who came before us didn't necessarily share our current ideals and morals or approach to the world, but because it's institutionalized, or it's been, this is how we do it, this is the process, this is how we move through the environment, that's the part where we perpetuate it sort of unknowingly. And so I think I too had some notes that Dr. Jacory used around it being more less overt, more subtle, harder to define and touch, because it takes a lot more thought and consideration and understanding and historical education about how these policies and ideas have come to sort of be shared as common in our universe. So I too, I'm comfortable with the word normal, normal procedure, normal policy. It's more like it's a common policy, and we've adopted it or adopted ideas in the larger culture that are then perpetuated against those who are maybe in a minority and have a minority experience. That is very important, but it sort of undermines the process moving forward. So I definitely appreciate those that shared before. I think they really hit all of my high notes, and I think it's really about those experiences and understanding how we contribute to them, sometimes unknowingly.
And Bishop Brown.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for allowing us to be here tonight. I think this is great. Of course, Dr. Brogdon and I have done quite a few of these together. I want to echo something that he said. I think one of the major issues in understanding systemic or institutional racism, whichever you choose to call it, I think the big issue is understanding the difference between racism and prejudice. That's where I think most of Americans are trapped, not understanding the difference between ethnicity and economics. From my perspective, when you're talking about prejudice, you're talking about ethnicity. When you're talking about racism, you're talking about economics. I think what we deal with in this country, now of course I'm going to use African Americans as an example, for 402 years, or if you want to trace it back to 453 years, you pretty much can. But I'll just say, for the sake of argument, for the last 400 years or so, the African Americans have been a part of a system that was never built for them. a system that never had, it never crossed the mind of the forefathers of this nation that African Americans would ever be a part of the system they created for success in this nation. And here we are in 2020, and we're still facing many of the same things, even as we heard earlier. It's been, I'll say, it's been more subtle up until the last 4 years, and I don't want to get too far over into that, but I think it's been a lot more subtle in years past than what we're seeing now. Now we're just kind of seeing overt situations of extreme racism, not only attaching itself to African Americans, but as we've heard, the Native Indians, whether, or you're talking about the Hispanic community and other nationalities of people here in this nation. Even though we are considered to be a melting pot, we still are dealing with the effects of institutional racism in this nation because we're dealing with a system that never included us.
Thank you. So starting with the definition is always nice, and then so we can kind of define our terms, and then I want to move very quickly into how I always understand things the best, which is by looking at actual examples. So if systemic racism is a pattern or an accepted history of policies, of practices that institutions carry out, that have been created by people, but they're sort of embedded in the bureaucracy. What does that really look like? Can each of you discuss some examples or some historical effects where institutional or systemic racism has directly affected your communities? And we can keep the same order, I guess, as we go. So Professor DeCory.
Come on.
Examples?
Sure. I thought this was a little bit of a difficult question until I started thinking about the Native community, and then I thought, oh, it's not that hard to answer then. But, in talking to students and people in the community here, which is mainly non-Native community, there are a few Native people, and during the school year, there are a lot of Native or more Native people at school, but it's pretty much a white community. We don't have hardly any Hispanic people here. We don't have any Black people. I think I can count 3, and they work at Safeway. So pretty white, community, and I don't think that I can't talk for white people, but I don't think that some people they feel like they haven't experienced racism. They don't know what it is to be looked at differently, or to be called names, or called a prairie nigger, or called, we were talking, I know I don't want to talk the negative language, but, that's part of systemic racism, but maybe it's normalized because they've never experienced it. They've never been around any kind of negative behavior, or people that have treated them differently because of their color. Maybe they don't know how to recognize it. And sometimes they might feel like something is wrong. It may be brushed off as not being, oh, that wasn't that bad. They didn't do that because I'm white, or they didn't do that because they really don't get it. And I'm going to give you a kind of a weird example, but I was thinking about this. As Lakota people, we have our history. I think many of you already know about the boarding school experience, the federal boarding school, and the missionaries, and how it was played out in the United States. And I that some of our people that went to the boarding school, the feelings are suppressed, the violence that occurred to them, or maybe they haven't come to terms with what happened. by the loss of language, cutting their hair, would take a cultural genocide, essentially. And the loss of parenting skills. How sad is that when you can't pass down those skills that make you what you are and make your identity, make you who you are as a Lakota person or as a Native person or as a person, and how to be a good relative. They didn't learn that because they had other experiences that were hated in them as they were raised and snatched from their homes and put into a really alien and violent environment. And so we have things like generational self-hate, loss of identity, loss of language, certainly. But I see folks, even our older folks now, who realize when their young relatives or grandchildren, for example, talk about decolonization and coming to terms with that red rage. In other words, well, grandma or grandpa, you're acting like this because this was taking the older ones now that they have to think about. You did really experience systemic racism, but you didn't come to terms with it, and you did because that was normal for you. That was something that the headmasters and so forth said, this is how it is, and this is how you're going to be able to cope in this world, this new world. And so I don't know, that's the example that I give for how it's affected our people directly.
Yes, thank you so much. And I just want to fill in a little bit. There was a brief period there where your internet connection was, we were
Lagging?
Yeah, we weren't lagging. That's the word. Thank you. Nouns, verbs. But if people didn't quite hear that, many of you may be familiar, but young American Indian people were taken away from their families, sent to boarding schools, prevented from going home. They were punished for speaking their native languages. They were forced to cut their hair, and they were the whole stated purpose was to get rid of the culture, just take away the culture completely, because it was felt that, well, I've heard Professor DeCory say the old cliche, it was very harsh, the idea that you kill the Indian to save the man. And so you have to give up everything that came from your traditional culture in order to make it in society. And I think that's not a weird example at all. I think it's a very clear example of a system that was designed to get rid of, the hope was that the whole American Indian culture would be wiped out completely. So I just wanted to fill in those blanks when you had your internet problem. Thank you.
I hope I won't continue to have that. I'm having the problem on this end of lagging from all the speakers.
Yeah.
So it's probably my computer then, and I don't know what to do.
Well,
So
we'll just bear with. It was very brief, so I think we'll be fine. So Dr. Brogdon,
Okay.
Examples from your perspective, examples of what systemic racism really looks like when it's in action.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about education the further we get into our discussion. But a part of systemic racism is that it's a system that's built on deception. So people in the majority culture, they're lied to about what has really happened. So we in American society, we have our myths, our narratives, our beliefs that are not always rooted in reality, in history. So I'll talk a little bit more about the historical piece a little further when we get into the panel, but I just wanted to name that because most Americans are miseducated about the real history of this country and why we are where we are. But what I want to focus on and give some specific examples to is not only are we miseducated, but then what the media does is the media portrays, it gives a false narrative about how good things really are. The reality is that even though we have Barack and Michelle Obama, Oprah Winfrey, Tyler Perry, LeBron James, and Michael Jordan, Black people are poor, okay? Now, the data tells us that white Americans represent 60% of the population. They own 90% of the wealth in this country. So you have 60% of the population, they have almost all the wealth. The Black community, we represent about 13.4% of the population. We own 2.6% of the wealth. We don't even have the amount of wealth that's commensurate with our, with the percentage of African Americans in this country. We have the same amount of wealth today that Black Americans had when we left slavery in 1865. How is that even possible? Home ownership rates are at the levels of where they were during the Great Depression. So you do have this small slither of African Americans who are doing well, and it is a small slither. And you would be fooling yourself if you think that that's the norm. So you need to read Eugene Robinson's book called Disintegration, because it'll help you to understand that when you're talking about Black America, you're actually talking about 4 different groups. And the largest, from a numerical standpoint, piece of that group are disenfranchised Blacks who have no wealth, no homes. What the data tells us, and you can look up the report called The Road to Zero Wealth, that by 2053, the Black community will be at zero wealth, okay, at zero wealth. So what poverty is devastating our communities. And when you pair poverty up with problems of mass incarceration, problems we have with policing, the Black community is on the path to being a permanent underclass, the bottom of this sort of, at the bottom of a very vicious caste system. So in the city of Louisville, we have what's called a $15 billion problem. And that $15 billion problem is 17,000 young Black people who are out of school and out of work. And this report is a little over a year old. And this was just a study done on Black Americans between ages 16 and 24. So the legacy of slavery and all the systems that followed, because this is what our educational system doesn't teach, is that slavery, even though it quote unquote ended, the system just morphed. And so it has produced these gross inequities where you have a mass of people who are disenfranchised, trapped in communities. They're then criminalized, blamed for what these systems have done. Now, the last thing I'll say is this. The reason the white community has so much wealth is, for example, they got the Homestead Act in 1862 that provided millions of acres of land for white Americans. 246 million acres of land. The government gave handouts to white Americans in 1862 and did not do that for African Americans. And of course, done even worse to our Native American sisters and brothers. In fact, the federal government gave out land that equates the size of California and Texas combined. I mean, our 2 largest states. I mean, they just gave land to white Americans. And one study puts that the number of homestead descendants living today at 46 million adults. So in this country that values individualism and you're supposed to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, you have millions of white Americans who were given land, given an opportunity to build wealth, then passing inheritances, passing land on to their descendants, while Black and brown Americans were being completely shut out from that system. And this is why then today, you have baby boomers passing down $9 trillion in wealth to their adult children. That's systemic racism. The Homestead Act, that's a racist policy. Mm-hmm. And the only way to repair a racist policy is to institute an anti-racist policy like reparations.
Thank you. Yes, that was I never got that in school about the exclusionary part of the Homestead Act. Okay, Secretary Branson Thomas, examples or concrete examples of how systemic racism affects your community?
Sure, I have two that I kind of wanted to discuss. The first one actually was an experience of mine that brought to light actually a very local concern and something that's become a discussion in the national media. So when I was a student in college, someone was learning that I was from the state of Oklahoma, and he asked me about our state mascot, your rivalry, the University of Oklahoma, and their mascot is the Sooners. And he did not know that I was a tribal citizen or that I was studying Native American studies, and asked me, about the mascot. And I acknowledged that the mascot embodied a similar land transaction that Dr. Brogdon described, and that Sooners were those who effectively jumped the line. They cheated. So this land was dispossessed from Indians, and then these people who were participating in the land run cheated other white people out of their homestead. And we celebrate this mascot, and we embody it, and it's something that even Native American citizens, support OU. So I'm not passing a judgment, but it was a really interesting sort of third-party experience for me, because I acknowledged the history and the problem with the potential mascot issue. And while it is not overtly Indian, right, it is subtly racist. And there was an acknowledgement at the end of our conversation. He was like, well, the Indians probably didn't need that land anyways, and kind of tossed the comment out at the table. And it was just a very interesting experience for me. Everyone at the table knew me better and got really quiet, and it was awkward, and I was young. And so I just kind of let it go, because I felt like I had already admitted to the fact that, my state perpetuates a subtly racist mascot. And then, as I moved on into my career, was really engaged in the mascot discussion with the Washington football team, and became really, engaged in that community. And so I still reflect back on that moment as a moment of my own realization of how racist it really was. And then that he felt like it was okay to acknowledge that Indians didn't deserve that land anyways. It wasn't really theirs. And to also recognize the history of being displaced from your original homeland and being in a place that really wasn't yours to begin with, and then to be further dispossessed. The second experience that I wanted to kind of bring up, I was a graduate student at Georgetown University, and was taking a course with a professor who was a budget guru. He had been working on the House side and the Senate side in the budget for over 50 years. And he invented sequestration. And I worked in DC during the time when the nation experienced sequester. And if you were a federally funded program, you're familiar that that policy basically forced all discretionary programs to reduce their federal budgets by anywhere between 5 and 10%, depending on where you were funded. Some, like the Indian Health Service, were forced to give up 13 to 15% of their discretionary budget. The Indian Health Service provides health care to the 3.2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives who live in this country as a result of the dispossession of land. And our communities were feeling the squeeze of sequester, and it was causing all kinds of problems. I was working in healthcare as a policy at the time, and I asked this professor, because he was very triumphant about his experience creating sequester. I created it. He was very, he owned it. And I asked him, IHS is an exchange. We agreed with the United States of America that we were going to give up this land and you were going to provide health care at your expense. And you didn't protect that budget. Why did you choose? Because there were other health-related programs that were protected. The Veterans Health Administration, there were the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, their budget was protected. So these other types of programs. And so I asked him specifically about this. And he was like, well, those treaties, no one cares about those treaties. And he was very frank, and I appreciated his honesty. you know? And he was like, and it's not even a means tested program. We don't even know if those people are poor. You know, most Indians are rich anyways. And so it runs the gamut in the experience for Indians. They're either very poor and dispossessed, or they are oil rich and, you know, living high on the federal funding, I guess. And so those two experiences alone, you know, he is a person who literally creates policy. He created legislation. He has historic engagement with that, and had no bones about expressing his racism in that moment, that Indians were undeserving, that there was not a trade, there was not an agreement that existed that constituted some kind of arrangement between tribal nations and the United States government. And so those are the kinds of things that perpetuate other problems. So when we experience sequester as a community, we lost providers, we lost healthcare, people who had cancer could not receive treatment. And so that had significant ripple effects. So entire families may have lost a generation because there was not federal funding to support desperately needed healthcare in primarily geographic isolated areas. And so he just had no sympathy for that. And those are the kinds of folks who are driving those policies and those ideas. So that's why I really appreciated Dr. Brogdon bringing up very early in the conversation that these are driven by historical understanding or misunderstanding of how the country works.
And have no knowledge of treaties or the federal Indian policy or the things that were affected, you know, that affect not only Native people, but other people today, as you've mentioned. So yeah, all those, don't get me talking about IHS, because that's a whole nother issue itself.
We'll have to have a panel just on that. So Bishop Brown, examples that you'd like to give to us about what systemic racism looks like in a practical way.
Sure. I'd like to take us back to the wording of the Constitution that was written and signed by the forefathers. Something as simple as all men are created equal. Let's just take a look at just that one statement, all men are created equal. When that statement was penned by the forefathers, going back to my earlier statement, they were not taking into consideration African Americans. They were not taking into consideration Native Americans. They were not taking into consideration any other ethnic group whatsoever outside of white America. We move ourselves all the way up to what most people often refer to in terms of Blacks, the Emancipation Proclamation, and we start talking about Abraham Lincoln. One of the things that many people, as they are always talking about Abraham Lincoln, and we heard our president say that no one has done anything for Black people any more than what he has, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln. But what most people fail to mention when talking about Abraham Lincoln is Abraham Lincoln's objective in terms of the Emancipation Proclamation was not to make Black people equal with whites. That was not his objective. That was not the plan. As a matter of fact, he was very outspoken on the fact of white supremacy, that Blacks would never be considered on the same level or platform of white America. And so I often say, from my perspective, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't necessarily free African Americans. It just pushed us over into another system of control. And if that's not the case, then I don't think we would have seen all of the issues that we dealt with Jim Crow. If we were free and if we were all created equal, would we have had to fight through the Jim Crow era? Would we have had to fight through redlining? Would we have had to fight through civil rights and all of the things that we've dealt with, all of the segregation? If we were all free, and if we were really free, according to the Emancipation Proclamation, would we have had to drink from a different water fountain, or sit in the balcony in a movie theater, or avoid touching, not eating from, but touching the lunch counter inside of a five and dime store where people were going for donuts and coffee? So there are so many different things. And even as we look in terms of where we are now, where we are right now, we still see the Black side of town. We still see Black neighborhoods. We still see white neighborhoods. We still see the upper class neighborhoods and the low income neighborhoods. I'll give you a prime example in the city of Bluefield in West Virginia, in my West Virginia church. We just recently dealt with something, and it may sound very simple, but here's a prime example of what I call systemic racism. On the north side of town, which is highly populated with African Americans, if you want to talk about high populations in the state of West Virginia, Black people. But on the north side of Bluefield, they decided all over the city that they were going to put in new speed bumps. And so they went over to South Bluefield. I'll start there. They went to South Bluefield, and they put in these really nice rubber speed bumps. So as you were passing through the very nice neighborhoods, you know, you could just kind of glide right over top of the speed bumps and everything was fine. They were made out of rubber and, you know, just nice little decor on them and all of this. Well, over on the north side of town, they went and poured asphalt, black asphalt, and they just raised a hump in the middle of the road. So as people were coming over, if you didn't slow down, you could literally just destroy your muffler or bust your oil pipes and all of those different types of things under your car. So I took it upon myself, along with many of the citizens of Bluefield, even though I don't live there, I've been pastoring there for 26 years. We took it upon ourselves to raise an issue with the city to say, this is not right. And we're not going to accept this. And so they could not understand what's the big deal. And so we had to go through this whole battle, this whole time of dialoguing and arguing just to bring them to an understanding that the people on the north side of town, they pay property taxes just like the people on the south side of town. They do everything that every other neighborhood does, but we're always the neighborhood that's always neglected. And so again, those are things that, you know, that we're looking at in terms of systemic racism. I'll give you one more example. Just recently with the whole stimulus situation, I just read this just a couple of days ago, that there were 63,000 African Americans that never received their stimulus check because of tax issues. 63,000 African Americans could not receive a stimulus check in the midst of one of the worst pandemics this nation has ever known, could not receive a dime of stimulus pay over tax issues that the government refused to help them with. That's systemic racism. And so these are the battles and things. So I don't know how anyone can say that it doesn't exist. Only thing you can say is that you've never been a victim of it, but it very much exists.
Well, and that, Bishop Brown, that leads me to my, you know, directly to my next question. And we have to try to deal with the miseducation, with the stuff that gets left out. And I think we're in a situation where a lot of people from the dominant culture, from white culture in our country, we're kind of like fish who don't know we're wet. You know, we just go through our lives and assume that this is how it is for everybody. We don't understand that our experience is not the same as everybody else's, because the country is still so segregated that I read a statistic, I'm sure you all are familiar with it, that I don't have the statistic for American Indian people, but most Black people have circles of friends and acquaintances and work colleagues that are very multiracial, multicultural, where white people, 90% of the people that they interact with are white. And so, of course, that changes a little bit depending on what part of the country that you're in. But one of the terms that we talk about is this idea of, for the challenge for white people, is something that we call decentering whiteness. And it kind of goes to what you've been discussing about how we just take these policies for granted. We think it's ordinary. We don't think back and ask ourselves, well, do we really want to be holding up the Sooner as a fun role model for, that we want to cheer for? So can you talk about this idea of maybe moving toward a solution to some of these issues about decentering whiteness? What would that involve? How can is that even a goal? Let's discuss that a little bit. We're back to you, Professor DeCory.
Okay. Well, let me see. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about cultural biases, and I was thinking more about culture versus race in this instance, because the community that you grow up in, that which you've been acculturated into, then those are the kinds of things that are your world. That's your reality. There was a book that came out just recently, maybe you folks know about it, but it's called White Fragility. Does that sound familiar to anybody here? By D'Angelo.
Yep.
And it's hard for white people to talk about racism. They get all defensive, they get hostile sometimes, they become angry, and they because they get, when they get confronted by saying that you are complicit in systemic racism or institutional racism, and so it isn't a good thing to be called a racist. People don't want to be called racist, but I think it's important that white folks start thinking about how they can do things differently to have a better understanding of why things happened. And I think the key is education. I truly do. I've been working, both of my parents were educators, and that was an interesting experience, because they are both Lakota and they're both from different reservations, but we were raised in primarily non-native communities in eastern South Dakota, where my dad was a coach, and we were the only native family in the community. And my dad was a coach there, and all the kids on his basketball team were white kids, big white boys, farm boys. And so we were like the good Indians. We weren't those reservation Indians, those poor, pitiful ones that live, differently than us. And so, I think that, and so we had to do a lot of education work as a family in these communities. And I think, we're not the only example. I think there are other examples throughout the United States where folks have had to try to educate other people into who they are and explain. As Native people, we know a lot about non-Native people. We know a lot about non-Native policies. We know we know their language, and we more or less forced to learn that so that we can understand how they think and why they do the things that they do. Because in order to cope, to be able to deal with the realities of living in modern America today. And so we know a lot about other kinds of institutions, but a lot of non-natives don't know about who we are as a people and what a beautiful culture and beautiful ways that we have. And we're very protective of those ways, but we're, we can share our ideas. We have a wonderful, beautiful philosophy, looking at the earth and looking at how we treat people and how we were raised to treat people. And so when I think of, this question, I was thinking also of, there's a lot of, I've heard people talk about allyship, building allies and whatnot. But interestingly enough, I think anyway, the term Lakota itself means ally or means friend. That's what Lakota translates as. And so we have been Lakota all our lives. We've tried to build those, and as those of us that have worked in the field have tried to to build those relationships with others, with other folks, and educating them. And change isn't easy. It's not easy. Sometimes it's really difficult, but it's okay. I think change happens anyway, whether you're on board or not. So it's better to learn about how other things, people do things, and being uncomfortable is going to have to be okay sometimes. I think it's all right to be uncomfortable and to try to see things in a different way. But that idea of equity and education, again, that's another whole situation. But building cultural bridges is something that I think many of us, especially as educators, have had to do all our lives. And I learned that very early on as a child growing up.
Thank you. Dr. Brogdon?
Yeah, I believe we are where we are in regards to race relations in 2020 because of a real crisis in two of our social institutions, our educational institutions and our religious institutions. A person who has a healthy, vibrant faith or a really good education should move beyond ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is thinking that you are the center of everything. People like you, that's the only history that matters. That's the only narrative. So what we try to do when we get people in our colleges and our universities is we try to help these young people to understand that they live in a bigger world, that the world is bigger than just them. Well, that's a problem because our educational institutions don't educate people to understand that they live in a big world. A lot of what we call history is nothing but propaganda. We are graduating people from colleges and universities who they have no awareness that lynchings were going on for decades in this country. So I mean, no context. They don't know about the Black codes. They don't know about convict leasing. And when you don't understand that, then of course you're not going to understand mass incarceration. You're not going to understand issues of policing, because we're not doing a really good job of educating people in a way that they can understand that the world is bigger. They can be a critical thinker. They can love their culture and their heritage and their country, while also recognizing, that there are some things that are not good. Building a country on slavery and genocide is gonna create particular problems. And we ought to just be able to be honest about that. So we need our educational institutions and our religious institutions, which a lot of them have just been co-opted in this whole history as well, where they, encourage the worship of one's culture. So this white supremacist kind of religion that Donald Trump is completely taken advantage of and used to his gain, is just a part of this kind of ugly history. And so that's why it's hard for people in the majority culture to really see why we are where we are, because they continue to think their experience is the normative experience. And the only way to explain the oppression of Black and brown people is to continue to criminalize and dehumanize and to project these kind of racist beliefs. Well, they have to do, the only reason we have kids in cages at the borders is because they must all be murderers. It's like, come on, we've been doing this for 400 plus years. This is madness. We're doing these things because we have a race problem in this country. And the race problem is tied to ethnocentrism and miseducation. And so the way to turn this thing around is by changing curriculum and what we're teaching in our schools, and to train better religious leaders and to have the kind of honest conversations in religious spaces where spiritual practices are taken very, very seriously, and we can begin to chart a new path in this country. And this is one of the reasons why I love working with Bishop Brown so much, because he's one of those leaders that's doing that hard and important kind of work.
Overhaul is needed. Thank you. Secretary Branson Thomas?
I just wanted to mention one thing here. I think it's been covered really well, particularly around the experience of going through a decentering process. And sometimes, I've had experiences where I was in Alaska. I didn't speak the language. I was in an Alaskan village. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was culturally appropriate, you know, in that moment. But the great news is that most Oklahomans have grown up in families and households that are both religious and have cultural norms that ask them to be humble and quiet and wait for someone to illustrate what's appropriate and what's fair, you know, and not to make judgments right off the bat. And so I think that's part of the process, and being very comfortable with change has got to be part of that discussion, because the reality is, in that moment, in that particular village, I just remember it very vividly because I literally didn't understand what was happening in the room. But I could see how people were interacting. So you stop listening and you observe. So use the senses that you have, use your knowledge and your inquisitiveness to ask questions of not just everyone around you, but of yourself, of how you are reacting to what's going on. Because and sometimes it's hard to do in that moment. So sometimes it's better to just sit back and experience it, and then spend some time being thoughtful about the experience and really questioning your own behavior and your own reaction, and really just being open to change. I have to be honest with you, like, as someone who grew up in Oklahoma, in a fairly homogeneous community here, where I didn't get to spend a lot of time with other tribal citizens experiencing culture in their, you know, in my own culture, that was something that was learned behavior, to sit back and observe and to understand that you have the skills. And I think most Oklahomans would agree that we try to raise our children in a certain way, and we bring them up in a certain way. And those skills you can lean on, and you can use them when you're uncomfortable with what's happening or or the discourse that's going on. And so I think for me, when I kind of read this question and was reflecting on it, it was like, you just have to be comfortable with change. You have to be comfortable asking questions, and you have to listen. And you don't always have to be right. I mean, you're going to mess it up. Like, I ate the food in this particular village. I ate the food in the wrong way, in the wrong order. There was an order, and I didn't realize that. And someone corrected me gently, you know, and I sat back. And so, but I was really excited to participate that. And I think that you just got to be willing to make a mistake and be humble about it, and move on and acknowledge your mistake and apologize, ask for forgiveness, and acknowledgement that you are a human and you're going to behave as a human, unfortunately. We all endeavor to do better the next time.
Well, and that's one thing that I occasionally I get to teach a class that we have here at OSU IT called Small Group Communication. And I see Teresa Cash in the audience. She's taught that class too. And it has a section in it on multiculturalism and multicultural education. And I've tried all different kinds of examples to try to spark that idea of curiosity in my students. And we've talked a lot about this, Lisa and I have in our committee, in planning events for the future, to try to spark in our students an interest and just a curiosity about ways of life and people who are different than we are. And we're thinking in terms of back, you know, when we can be back on campus and back together, how much fun it will be to present windows into other cultures, starting with food, because that's always
food is a good place to start.
just trying to get young people to have some curiosity, to look beyond eating at McDonald's, you know, just to think about that it is a big world out there, that sense of interest in our fellow human beings. Bishop Brown, thoughts that you have about this decentering process, or trying to help people realize that they are in fact wet and they are fish?
Yeah, I think the key, going back to pretty much everything everyone has said here, just to kind of summarize, I think the key educationally is the word diversity. Trying to get people to understand the value, the significance, and the importance of diversity. In my life, growing up, early on in my life, I grew up, the first part of my childhood, I grew up in a suburb right outside of Washington, D.C., in Alexandria, Virginia. We were literally the only Black family in our entire community. And that was a whole nother set of issues. Never really had any major racial issues, anything like that that I could really, that I can really remember. But that's where I started kind of getting introduced to the whole concept of diversity. One of my closest friends was a Korean, and I was just, and we communicate to this day. You know, we were in first and second grade together, and I can remember going to his home and going back to something that you mentioned earlier, where I learned about diversity was over food, because they were eating kimchi, and they were eating egg rolls and all these types of things, and I knew absolutely nothing about those. You know, I was kind of a collard greens and barbecue rib type guy, and so that's all that I knew in terms of food and dietary things. So learning that culture kind of introduced me to diversity. Well, shortly after that, my parents divorced, and I wasn't really forced, but I moved to Southern West Virginia in the heart of Appalachia. I moved to Southern West Virginia, and when I got to West Virginia, there was absolutely no diversity whatsoever. You didn't see any other nationality of persons outside of African Americans and whites. And we all got along there for the most part. You know, in the 70s, we all pretty much got along pretty well, but there was just so much division between understanding our races and our ethnicities. And so when you look at elementary books, our middle school books, or high school books, we did not see very much diversity in there. I'm being really blessed tonight just listening to Native Americans and Native Indians communicating and talking about their experience, because again, this is something that I haven't really been exposed to, with the exception of the couple of years I was in Tulsa in school. But you know, I'm just listening to them and I'm saying, man, it's amazing how our stories really connect in terms of Native Americans and African Americans. It's, you know, but now I've had the privilege of standing in 38 countries, whether preaching, teaching, or lecturing. I've been able to stand in 38 countries. And so I understand diversity, you know, from a larger scale. But I really believe that is the key to us moving forward. I often say this, and I'm finished, that when you look at segregation and desegregation, when you're talking about the concept of segregation, African Americans did pretty well during times of segregation. You know, but when we started to desegregate and we started, you know, it was more African Americans moving, you know, learning the white culture of doing things, as opposed to whites ever being exposed, challenged, or positioned to do anything as it related to the African American culture. And so, you know, so now you'll see Black people that will be judged because we don't talk the same way. And Dr. Jeremiah Wright, if you ever want to hear someone that really brings out the whole issue about how we talk and our language and our thought processes, Dr. Jeremiah Wright is a brilliant mind as it relates to those types of things. But we were not, you know, other races and nationalities of people were not integrated into the Black culture. It was always Blacks doing things just like white people. And so if we didn't talk like white people, we weren't accepted.
Yes, that's
Dana,
still,
can I add something to that?
please, yes, please.
I just wanted to share something with folks there. I had a really wonderful opportunity to learn about diversity as a young academic. I was actually, I was just still in graduate school, but I was teaching at a tribal community college in North Dakota, and I received a humanities scholarship to travel to West Africa. And I went with the Phelps Stokes Ethnic Heritage Seminar out of Washington, D.C., and traveled to West Africa, Togo, Dahomey, Nigeria, Ghana for 3 months in 1974. And that was really an eye-opening experience for me. I was able to see traditional African culture and talk with people, academics, and mainly academics though. But there was, I want to give one example. There was a And that's why I think that the idea of being tribally centered was something that I was able to relate to the African culture and the African people, because I knew about ritual. I knew about the kinds of things that connect us as a tribal people. And most of the group, the 30 or so people that were in this group, they were all Black Americans, but they weren't, they had never been to Africa, just as I. And I was the only Native American. Then there were 2 non-Native white guys and 2 nuns. And it was an interesting group. But nevertheless, what happened was we went to one ceremony in one of the villages, and they were asked to our Black leaders were asked to step in the goat's blood of a goat that had been ritually killed for us as guests in their community. And a couple of the Black women, older women that were part of that, would not do it because they thought it was very disgusting and it was embarrassing to them. And so a couple of the younger Black participants, so professors that were in the group, readily stepped forward and did it because they didn't want to be rude or, to hurt their feelings. But I understood right when they started the ceremony, even though we don't make sacrifices of goats because we don't eat goats, but I understood the idea of respecting their ways and understanding that this is how things are done here. And so the idea, again, when Tara talked about observing and taking cultural cues and looking and listening, that's really important. Listen and talk less, but we're all talking lots tonight. But and really observe things. I think that's a real key to help people to have a better understanding of the other, if they can kind of, if they're immersed in it, but also to pay attention to what's going around you. But anyway, that was really an enlightening, and I really treasure those experiences, and they help me to better understand the other in my life, and changed me drastically for the rest of my life in a good way.
World travel will change you, it really will. We do have a question from the audience, and it kind of, I think it relates back to just something that Dr. Brogdon touched on very briefly, which was the idea that if you go back and look at how under a heading of institutional racism, deliberate policies that excluded certain groups, and the one that he mentioned was the Homestead Act, and how white settlers got land for free, and of course the land had originally been taken away from the Native American people, and then there were people of color were excluded on purpose from benefiting from that distribution. And then you touched on the idea that the only way to make up for that is to try to have reparations, or have something that repairs the fact that the thumb was on the scale earlier. People got an unfair advantage that other groups did not get. So I think this question relates to that idea. The question is, can we talk a little bit about affirmative action and how that might fit in? So we just have a few minutes left, so I want to just ask which of you would like to address that. Somebody want to
go ahead.
Affirmative action, there's just so much pushback and a lot of baggage on that term. And I'm really surprised just how much traction reparations has gotten in the past few years. I mean, if you would have asked me 2 years ago, would we be having serious conversations about reparations in this country, I would have laughed. But Marianne Williamson, who was a candidate for president on the Democratic side, she spoke in Louisville. Almost all of the Democratic candidates who were running for president were weighing in on the reparations issue. So HR 40 has been introduced on the House of of Congress for the past 30 years, and it's just asking for a study of the issue of reparations, and it's never been voted on, but it's gaining more and more traction. The only way you're going to get something like affirmative action is if you can educate the white community to understand that they have been getting affirmative action from the very beginning. And not only were they getting things like the Homestead Act, but the New Deal, the GI Bill. These are all government policies that built wealth and gave privilege and advantage to white Americans. And so if the federal government did this, then the federal government has a responsibility to repair those who have been wronged historically in this country. Now, we have given some modicum of reparations to the Native American community. It's deplorable what was done, but they did that. They gave reparations for the Japanese Americans who experienced the internment camps. It's called the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Canada did the same thing. Germany, of course, paid over 50 billion in reparations to the Jews. And I don't know what sensible person would stand up and say giving reparations to the Jews for what was done between 1933 and 1945 is something that's problematic. But for some reason, when you want to have a conversation about giving reparations to people who were oppressed for 246 years of slavery, followed by black codes, convict leasing, lynching, Jim Crow, redlining, now mass incarceration, that it's somehow outlandish. So there are decent proposals being put forth, like endowing all HBCUs as something that's a start, maybe eliminating student loan debt for African Americans. It has to be something structural. We're not asking white Americans to do it. We're asking the federal government to do it because the federal government created this problem.
Thank you. Anybody else have anything to add to that? That's the only question I'm seeing at the moment from the audience. So anybody else want to talk about affirmative action or how it might work or how it might have been misunderstood? Covered?
I don't know that I have I don't know that I have a good academic answer. I'm not as well read as those as other panelists on this particular issue probably, but I feel like it's another example of a policy that someone created, and it was, for lack of a better word, bastardized over time. And it started in a good place, and we moved beyond that good place. And I think it was well-intentioned, and there are lots of policies, that both of our communities have experienced that started in a good place with good intentions and didn't take into account the community, the culture, the understanding, the historic constructs that create other disadvantages. Particularly Indian students. I was a first-generation college student. This community probably meets a lot of first-generation college students, and they struggled in very different ways than students who have parents who have degrees or even secondary educations or certificates. And affirmative action sought to kind of create a balance, but it just was bastardized over time in a way that made it very dysfunctional, not just for colleges and universities who are trying to adapt to it, but for communities, really, because it misses the mark and in some cases sets students of color up for unsuccessful experiences in higher education or in secondary education because they weren't really prepared. And it goes back to this, not misinformation or miseducation, but a lack of education, a lack of opportunity that exists in those communities. And then you put them in a universe where they cannot be successful, and because of everything that happened prior to that. So it's just a lack of understanding and knowledge of individual student experiences and bringing them in. And I just think over time it's become something that everyone can agree isn't working the way that they intended. And that doesn't mean it's bad, because I think the intention was good. I just think we're not doing it any service by continuing to bastardize the process and the policy.
I love that term. And I'll just briefly follow up on it. What we tend to do in America is we don't want to address structural issues. So we like Band-Aids. And so affirmative action is just something small that we can do. If we would have done something more substantive in previous years, we wouldn't be where we are today. But each generation just keeps kicking the can down the street. And the more you keep kicking the can down the street, the more it's going to cost the nation to address these issues. And so one of the reasons we have such social chaos and upheaval today is because Martin Luther King Jr. was telling this country about these economic issues in the late 60s, and the country chose to ignore him after he was assassinated, then waited to the 80s, completely changed the narrative on what he stood for, turned him into a dreamer, and we never addressed these fundamental issues of inequality, racism, and mass poverty, and now it's spilling into our streets. Look what the COVID pandemic has really revealed about this country. And so I just hope we don't try to kick the can down the street for the next generation and say, you all deal with it. I think it's on us. What can we do that's substantive? We're not going to fix all the problems, but can we just do something substantive that the next generation can build on? So that's what I'm passionate about, and that's what I'm working toward. And it's just been great being in conversation with you all on tonight.
And this is a good chance for me to jump in and remind everybody or announce again that on the 9th of December at 3:00 in the afternoon, we are having another panel discussion like this on that exact topic, the impact of the pandemic on minority communities, because that's another thing that I think is not on people's radar. A statistic just leaped out of the New York Times at me of the deaths of people in this country under the age of 21 from the COVID-19 disease. 74% of those young people are either Black Americans or Hispanic Americans. And that's just appalling. So we are going to address that on the 9th. So I think rather than go with one of the more complex questions that I had in the few minutes that we have left, I just would like to go around again very briefly and just, if you could all take a couple of minutes to kind of make a closing statement, anything you want to follow up on, any advice you have for the future. Professor DeCory?
Okay. It's been a wonderful few minutes here with you. It's just like a little wrinkle in time, so to speak. But thank you for allowing me to say some words tonight. When I tell my great-grandchildren about a time when we used to have the talk with our kids, with my sons, and you all know what the talk is. You have to explain to them, don't do this and don't do that. If you get stopped by a police officer, don't do this. Make sure they see your hands. And so we have talked to our sons and all our relatives about that. As Lakota people, you know, you hear people say driving while Black. Well, we've been driving while Indian, DWI, for a long, long time. And so you have to be really, careful how you conduct yourself. So I look forward to the day when we don't have to have the talk with our children, and they're not killed because of their race, or they're not hurt because of what they look different than somebody else. And hopefully our society will be one which encompasses the ideas and philosophy of Indigenous people and other peoples as well, other cultures. Diversity is the key. And I think that we should all be willing to put the work into that. And I'm so happy to hear that, Professor Brogdon and Bishop Brown and Teresa Cash and Tara and Dana and Lisa and many other people that are working to make the change and to make things better for future generations. We as Lakota people, we plan and do things for the next 7 generations. So that puts a big responsibility on us as individuals to try to make those changes. And as a person of faith in Lakota spirituality, prayer and meditation and having the responsibility to take care of Mother Earth and the lands that we as Native people will put on these lands to take care of them. So I take that as a really big responsibility as a grandmother, and hope that that we can be honest and true to our ancestors who worked and lived to stay alive so that we can be here today. So I acknowledge the lands that my ancestors lived on, and I find that many other universities and places, institutions, are acknowledging Native lands in that way in their institution statements now. And I think that's one step forward for reparation or to acknowledge that the original inhabitants here. And another suggestion or something that I would like to leave with is that each one of us has a role to play. You know, it's no mistake that we've been put on this earth for some reason. You know, Tunkashila, our creator, put us on the earth for some purpose in life, and we need to find that purpose. And I encourage, and I'm thankful that all of you are finding that purpose and doing what you need to do the best that you can be a good person and to share those gifts with other people. So thank you for letting me speak this evening. Mitakuye oyase. For all my relatives, we are all related.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very briefly, Dr. Brogdon.
Yeah, just want to again thank you for the opportunity to be a part of just a wonderful evening, an important time to converse over, you know, issues of systemic racism. A lot of people know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Spoke out against the Vietnam War, and he became very, very unpopular for it. What a lot of people don't know is that King's repudiation of America's involvement in the Vietnam War was not just because he was a pacifist, but because he understood that a country that's committed to militarism will never build the kind of programs it needs to build the nation and to break down this class system. And so we have this crisis of imagination, this imagination of scarcity, where it's not enough for everybody. When in all actuality, we spend more on defense than all the advanced democracies and advanced countries combined. We can begin to reduce the amount we're spending on the military-industrial complex, and we can begin to not only build the infrastructure of this country, but to redress age-old problems in this country. And we could be such a better country than we are right now. So don't think that we can't afford it. We really can. We just have to have the imagination to see new possibilities in something that's old. And so I'm just excited to work alongside people like you who are doing this work. Thank you.
Thank you for being here and on such short notice. Thank you so much. Secretary Branson Thomas, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to applaud everyone that joined the call tonight and is going to watch the video later. This is a really tough conversation. It's a complex issue that people experience in all different ways. And I just, you know, this is a very energizing conversation for me. In my day-to-day work, I don't get to engage in these kind of complex topics, and there's not always a time, you know, to reflect on them. And I appreciate everyone who shared their story tonight, and really just applaud those who stuck it out late in the evening and engaged. And I'm not that far from you all. So if there is, you know, a desire to have additional conversations or follow-up discussion one-on-one, I definitely offer that. And just really applaud you and challenge you to take what we shared tonight and continue to ask questions and continue to engage in the topic, because it certainly takes more than 90 minutes to really understand and to delve deeply in a meaningful way. So thank you again, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the energy. I really appreciate it. Definitely have more work to do. So thanks a lot.
And thank you again. You also were able to step in for Nancy Mason, who couldn't be here tonight, and we just really appreciate your doing that on such short notice. And Bishop Brown, we're last to you. Closing thoughts?
Right. Yeah. Again, thanks to all of you panelists. You were awesome and excellent. I learned a lot tonight as well, and I thank you for sharing your experiences. And I think something I'm often saying, we have to have the hard conversations if we're going to advance, if we're going to move together as a society and as a people. We're going to have these hard conversations. I'm pessimistic when it comes to my generation, which is, I guess, Generation X. I don't know. I kind of feel like sometimes I feel like a millennial because I have 15-month-old twins. So sometimes I feel like a millennial but early in the morning, I feel like a senior citizen until I can get going. But I'm pessimistic when it comes to my generation. And, in terms of re-educating and trying to move forward, my generation and those that are older than me, I'm somewhat pessimistic. But I am extremely optimistic with millennials, Generation Z, and those that will be coming in future generations. I really do believe that we are turning the corner in terms of educating with diversification and understanding our roles and understanding our cultures and our ethnicities. And I believe that even though I'm not in favor of the burning down of buildings and the looting and all of those things in the streets of America, I am very excited about the unity that I see among the races of people that make this the United States of America in terms of their unification and coming together and being a voice and saying that, that we're not going to put up with this foolishness and this division and this segregation and stuff that has separated us. We're not going to do it. And we're not going to have it any longer. And then I'll leave you with this, your coworker, Miss Lisa, make sure that you ask her about an experience that we had together. I took her through the mountains of West Virginia. She was just a young lady at Morehead State University in Morehead, Kentucky. I was a student in Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia, and our choirs combined, and we were on a choir trip. I took her through the mountains driving a van with choir members on it, and I turned off the headlights, and I would not dare share with you the things that professional beautiful young lady said to me. I would never share those things with you publicly, but in your private time, please make sure you have a conversation with her about that, because after 35 years, I'm still holding on to it. So God bless you all. I enjoyed this today.
Now there's a story that I'm going to have to get. Thank you, Bishop. So,
thank you, everybody, for this evening. It's been a real pleasure listening to everyone. I'm so thankful that you all could join us today. On the timely note, this has been recorded. So if you go to osuit.edu, type in diversity and inclusion, it will be up on our page if you want to revisit or if you want to share with anybody who wasn't able to make it tonight. And so that would be really wonderful, again, to continue having this conversation. So thank you all. Safe travels to anyone who has to be out in the world traveling around. And thank you again. Many thanks, many blessings.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
thank you, Randy.
Yeah,
Good
I think
job.
we did okay. You too.
I really learned a lot. That was amazing.
Yep, lots of notes taken.
Yes, me too. I was writing. Thank you
There we
so
go.
much for the MC job.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to jump in and say that we probably need to look at trying to do a part 2.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah,
So-
we've got a lot of it's a big topic, very big topic.
Hey, Chris.
Sure.
Hey, Chris. My classmate. Good to see you, Chris.
All right, ladies and
Later.
gentlemen.
Or everybody, later.
Good night, Randy. Thank you.
Good night.